everyone, and welcome to the next session. I'm very happy to present the next speaker. Christiaan from Smart Travel Lab is going to give us some great strategic insights into building back better. And that's pretty much all that I'm going to say, Christiaan, because you'll introduce yourself and take the session away. So over to you. Thank you so much for joining us at New Baltic Hospitality Forum.
Thanks a lot, Hilary. And good morning, everybody. So I'm calling from Amsterdam, as you can see from the beautiful background. And I didn't realize I actually started wearing the same shirt as the water picture behind me. But good morning, everybody. I'm Christiaan Uittenbosch. I'm one of the co-founders of Smart Travel Lab, like Hilary was mentioning. And Smart Travel Lab is basically an innovation agency, which is focusing really on breakthrough sustainable innovation for the travel and hospitality industry. And we really try to help organizations with inspiration and solutions, especially in these times, to build back better. And just maybe to kick it off, I'd like to take you back to a moment about almost 7 months ago, in March 2020, when we were in the middle of running our first major program around emission-free travel. One of the programs where we actually focused on looking for new solutions in the area of emission-free travel, connecting breakthrough startups to major travel companies. And while it actually took us about 2 years to get the program launched and get big travel organizations convinced to invest in this type of breakthrough innovation, it took about 2 weeks to kill everything. So by the middle of March, we had to stop the entire project. By the end of March, we had to repay hundreds of thousands of euros to the organizations that were participating, and we were technically bankrupt. And the reason that I'm saying this is I can imagine that many of you, or some of you at least, but maybe even many of you, would most probably be in similar type of situations if you look about half a year ago. The lockdown in the Netherlands started, where I'm calling from, in the middle of March. So what we did with that is basically, while obviously it was extremely painful at the beginning, we quickly tried to think, how do we then deal with this situation? How do we try to anticipate what the future might look like? Where can be potential opportunities for us as an organization, but also as an industry? So we worked together with one of our partners, Kantar, and the Futurist team that they have in-house. And we developed basically different scenarios to give us a bit of perspective on how can we deal with this type of situation. And this is what you see here. Just a simple model which might help you even today when you do your scenario planning. And I know in many countries, we're at the verge of new lockdowns. In the Netherlands, they're going to call it tonight. So we're going to have another even stronger lockdown as of tonight. So this will help us with scenario planning. So what you see here is basically on the horizontal axis, you see on the left-hand side, what would happen if there's a one-time outbreak in my country or in my region, or maybe in some of the source destinations where some of our travelers or guests are coming from, because obviously that's impacting us heavily as well. And on the right-hand side, you see what's happening when there's more recurring or seasonal outbreaks of COVID. And what you see on the vertical axis is the type of reaction from both consumers, guests, travelers, but also from governments. How do they deal with this type of situation? And what you see at the bottom is a more controlled reaction. So we are able to absorb the impact. There are strict regulations and people are actually adhering to it and staying pretty controlled. And on the top side, you see a more panicked reaction, whether it's more from governments not taking the right action or whether it's from consumers or guests who have a more panicked reaction. And what we've seen here is, while we drew this out about 6 months ago in April, we obviously realized we're now more the right-hand side in most of the markets. So it's a recurring outbreak or seasonal outbreak. And we also see that while there was a pretty controlled reaction in many markets in the beginning, we see now more of a panicked reaction in some. So without going into all the details, but we will make this report available with all the details, so you might want to use it for your scenario planning. I just want to touch upon the two most likely scenarios which are most relevant for you. And the reason why we put this out here and why this might help you is when you actually design and prepare and build the scenarios for your own individual organization, you might want to do it, and we purposely pull them apart, because we know in reality what happens is that there's actually a scenario which touches upon a couple of these scenarios, and that's a reality how it goes and plays out. But this might help you prepare your organization and prepare for the most likely scenarios. So I'll briefly touch upon the two, and we'll make sure through Hillary we'll make the reports available for everybody. Well, what we see here is basically what we call 2 seasons, 2 travelers. So COVID will actually create its own seasons. During the moment that there's actually opportunity to travel, go out, go into restaurants and bars, go into normal travel destinations, there will be a specific rush to enjoy good food and travel. What you will see is that travel and hospitality companies have actually looked for alternative business models, look for where can we actually source revenue from. But you will also see an element which we call pandemic costs, where you actually see people who have more to spend. They'll be able to spend their time in what we call escapist luxury, while others are not don't have the funds or the possibility to actually travel or enjoy going out. So this is something that you will see, and in the full report, which you might find helpful for your scenario planning, is we'll show you what the impact is on business, what the impact is on the mindset of people, what the impact might be on different generations, and what are some of the opportunities that you can find in this area. And the second scenario, which I just briefly want to touch upon, is what I think is for sure is the case in many parts of Europe, for sure in the Netherlands, which is something which we call more of a brave new reality. And there's safety, but there's a lot of regulations which is coming in its place. And what we see is COVID is unstoppable for the moment, but it's in some ways at least manageable. So the government is imposing rules on everything from whether it's cleaning standards to design regulations. They're getting the opportunity to actually requisition resources, whether it's hotels or kitchens or planes, when they need it during COVID season. And you also see, and I think this is something that we see in many of our markets, they pretty quickly close borders when there's a rise in the number of infections. So the reason why we explain it again is when you pull these scenarios apart and look at what this impact might be for your organization, it will help you prepare and actually look at how can I organize and be prepared for different potential futures. So this is more what could the future potentially look like. And the second thing which I want to touch upon is actually if you look at the need, but also the opportunity for companies which are struggling in this moment for innovation are huge. And we can actually say that there are a lot of opportunities in there. And what we've tried to do is we looked together with our partner Kantar at what are some of the main trends which we already saw pre-COVID. And we identified 50 sub-trends of what we call energies. And what we've seen through COVID is actually try to look at what are some of these energies which are accelerating because of the pandemic. So it's not necessarily completely new trends. Many of these elements were already emerging, but are now being accelerated because of the pandemic. And so we've got 20 innovation areas which might help you to inspire you for innovation, and we bucket them basically in 3 major themes. So the first one, obviously, I think a no-brainer is very much around health and safety, and how do we integrate it in the journeys of guests and travelers. The second one is very much, and I can imagine if you look at your own reflections, people are reflecting on the way they travel, whether it's business travel, it's an obvious one, but also how they've been traveling in the last couple of months in summer season. So people becoming a lot more conscious. And what can we learn from that? And what can we actually use in our advantage? How do we potentially need to tweak our business model, or can maybe even come up with new business models? What do we need to take into account of this changed mindset and people becoming more conscious around the way they travel? And the third big theme is basically what we call mixed reality. It's how does the normal reality actually is complemented by what we call a virtual reality? And what are the opportunities in that area? If we realize that people are not allowed or not able to travel the world like they used to, still want to experience new things, we see an extreme development in this area where actually virtual reality and a new type of reality is actually complementing the existing reality. So we'll touch upon these 3 themes. I'll go through it in a pretty rapid pace for the next 15 minutes or so. But what we'll make sure is that you get a copy of the full extensive report of the individual themes to your disposal, so you can actually use it to your benefit. So the first theme that we want to get into is basically what we call the hygiene hassle. So at the beginning, it's been in most of the markets, people are wearing face masks. There are sanitizers everywhere. You see more queues because actually what's happening is there are fewer people allowed within airports, within hotels, within shops. So there's a lot of hygiene hassle which we're experiencing, and people are slowly adopting to it. In some countries, they're doing it more stringent than in others. But if we now try to project, what is that going to look like? What do we want if we're in the business of hospitality? So we want to make it as comfortable for people as possible. And what we see is that people will continue to have a more risk-aware attitude in the next couple of months and maybe even years. And they want health and well-being to be an important element, but they want it to be as integrated in the journey. And what we see here in terms of elements which are going to play a role are design, beauty, aesthetics, and touchless tech. And these elements will continue to play an important role. And I'm just going to touch upon a couple of interesting examples. And again, in the report that will be made available, there will be more details and some other interesting solutions that might inspire your own business. So what we've been doing for all of these is there's one big theme, then there are specific innovation areas. In this time, I'll quickly run through them. There's an element around contactless connections, which means there are no longer any queues that we see. There's an element of collective security, which is we're willing to give some of our data to have more collective security. There's got to be an increased focus on well-being, and not just physical well-being and making sure that we're safe and healthy, but also mental well-being. You will see, and you most probably notice, a lot of people are actually starting to struggle much more with their mental health, having to work at home for a long time, suffering from the increased risk, maybe fitting into a generation or a category which is more vulnerable for COVID. So you see it has an impact on their mental well-being. And what can we do with it from an hospitality perspective, and how can we integrate that into our solutions? Some of the elements that you see is actually shielded spaces. This was one of the pictures and one of the solutions that came out, I think, maybe already 2 weeks after the pandemic really came to Europe, where you saw how can we actually use design, not as a thing which looks ugly, but actually as a way that we use design, practical design and aesthetics to make things look nicer. So this is an example of what, for example, travel could look like. And at the same time, you're actually maybe shielded from your neighbors, which in normal travel, you were maybe a bit annoyed by the fact that you were sitting next to others. And this is actually helping to shield it in a nice and subtle way. Another solution is from Metro in Turkey, in Istanbul. How can you actually use your experience? So this is a restaurant which is actually using these bowls to have more romantic, secluded type of dining experiences. So you have an interesting location and you actually make it even more stunning, romantic, interesting, while at the same time you have a stronger notion of hygiene. So what are some solutions that you can use rather than the normal plexi and plastic dividers which you see in many places at the moment? How can we actually design that differently? So what we call shielded spaces. Another example, which I briefly mentioned, is collective security. What can we learn from other crises which have happened before? And this is an example of Haina in the North Shore of Hawaii, where they actually suffered from major flooding a few years ago in 2018. And what can we learn from places like this? There's a great case study, what we can learn from it, because they were actually already in the meantime suffering from not just the flooding, but actually a flood of tourists. And there was extremely overcrowded beaches, a lot of pollution, over tourism in these places. When they had the floods and they had no proper emergency plan, they actually started using data to allow a specific number of people in the region. So it's limiting the number of people that can actually go, which is giving a much better experience. It's making sure that they're aware of where people are traveling in the region, so they can actually give them signs when there are potential emergencies. So what can we learn from other cases and other crises that are relevant for us? For example, if we're a destination, or if you're thinking about a city of Tallinn. And then other elements which I think are very interesting, one of the themes which you call aesthetic purification. So we see hand sanitizer, and this morning I had to go through 2 places to go with my hand sanitizer, which were pretty ugly and they're always in a place, and it's getting a little bit better along the way. But we can actually, how can we turn that around? How can we make this beautiful, can make it integrated, can make it something that people actually aspire? And this is an interesting example, and I think the title says it all, Clean Made Cool from Touchland. So an interesting example around aesthetic purification. Another example is from Frank Chu, one of the designers, which is a sanitizing lamp or sterilizing lamp. So the things that you put below it, actually because of the UV light, are being sterilized. So you will see more and more of these type of solutions where actually aesthetics, health and safety are going to be integrated. And one of the last
Ik heb op 17 juli 2021 geen afspraken.
Is, not sure what happened there, but one of the last ones which you want to touch upon is bioadaptive design. And what can we learn from nature, and what can we use in the way we actually design this? And this is an example of a hotel where one of the main elements which is being used for face masks, one of the main products which is actually silver or copper. And why is that being used is actually because of the fact that they, if you use COVID on copper, actually can only survive for a very limited period of time, which is interesting, and that's why it's included in face masks, for example. But what you see here is how can you potentially integrate copper as a more sterilizing or hygienic option. So you see copper in doorknobs, but you also see copper in examples like bed linen and bed sheets. Interesting example from copper decor, where they're actually integrating copper in such a way. So what we're expecting, what we're seeing already emerging is not necessarily in your face or nuisance in terms of hygiene or safety, but it's actually ways of integrating a more safe feeling within the way you design or the way you organize your hotel or your travel destination. So that's it in terms of seamless safety. So how do you integrate safety in as seamless way as possible in the overall journey? The second main topic that we want to touch upon is conscious travel. So what we see, it's not something which is new. We saw sustainable travel in the past. We saw elements of conscious travel emerging already, which is basically a new sense of consciousness and a way to travel in a more sustainable fashion. We saw the big impact of authentic local experiences, and even a big platform like Airbnb was promoting this over the last couple of years. So how do you come up with much more authentic local experience? And you see here that people are looking for a new level of consciousness. People are looking at the way they travel in a very different way. So the impact that this is having is a lot of things are turning back local. If you look at it from an F&B perspective, if you look at it building materials, so how do you use local building materials, whether it's wood or other elements, but also how do we focus on traditions which maybe we forgot about in the past, and how can we actually bring that back in our experience? Well, at the same time, if you look at the elements like waste, you already saw that this is with the whole circular evolution, things which are now being eliminated and seen as a more systemic design flaw. So what can we learn here? And again, there are a couple of main innovation areas. One is around everything which is related to more climate positivity. So how can we use this to build back better? You hear about the green recovery, for example, but actually, how do we look at it from when we build back our business? How can we actually look at more climate positive solutions? A couple of elements which I'm going to touch upon in the next few slides, but one which I'm not going to touch upon, so just briefly talk about here, which is what you see on the right-hand side, which is travelers and guests wanting and their desire to contribute. And we've seen that over the last couple of months where they want to contribute to society. And that's going to be interesting here as well. So how can you include that, whether you're a hotel, a destination, a travel player, how can you include that? The notion that people actually want to contribute to make things better. And if you look at the element of add-on altruism, which is doing positive things for others, whether it's for elderly, whether it's for other vulnerable people, whether it's for the environment, how can you trigger that? And how can you support that and allow that to happen for guests who are joining your property? Just a couple of things to touch upon. One is obviously small scale, the element of tiny houses, which was emerging. People don't want to go to mass destinations, mass hotels at the moment, and they won't want to go there for the upcoming period. And you already saw a big emergence in terms of small scale, different type of experiences. Another one is what we call the trend of local, everything going local, whether it's your lemonade, and this is an interesting example for what we call Lepa lemonade, which is actually made from the residues of apples, which are locally sourced and actually then sold within only an area of 50 kilometers to the location where it's actually being produced. So you see things going local. And this is an example of how we present everything within our report. So you always see a bit of description of the trend. You see an innovation example on the top right-hand corner, but you also see questions, and that's what we wanted to share with you today in terms of what are some business implications? What are some of the opportunities that you can consider as an organization? Another interesting example is the Nordic cookbook is trends which maybe have forgotten in the past. And this is where you look at Scandinavia, the Nordics, where you actually see traditions coming back again. And this is in the area of F&B. So it's an interesting example. And one which is very close to my heart, which you see emerging, and basically during Climate Week, a week and a half ago, this was a huge travel summit, which was around regenerative travel, which means how do we, and this is going one step further than sustainable travel, which I think is fascinating, is how do we allow guests and travelers to actually help generate? So how can we really turn tourism and travel into a force for good, which means developing, for example, new tourist experiences or destinations in places where they're no longer tourists, or whether maybe the environment is not in a very good state. How can we bring new touristic attractions to those locations, supporting the community, maybe delivering back, bringing back work in that area, but also restoring the environment? I think there's a fascinating example of Playa Viva in Mexico, and you see a growing number of places actually emerging with what we call regenerative tourism or regenerative travel. And one of the main trends which most we see, mostly not yet next year, but maybe the year after, is what we already saw from camping going to more luxury, which we call glamping. You will now see a development which goes into re-glamping, which is regenerative glamping. So allowing people to actually support the environment. And just to round this up and and I think I've got another 2 minutes left before Hilary jumps in. So this is a report which we're currently finalizing and we'll share with everybody next week, which is the interesting notion of mixed reality. So I think just try to change your mindset from looking at how can virtual actually no longer be seen as a limitation. We've been working from home, which is far from ideal in many markets. But how can we use it to add to a much richer experience? If you look at the number of features which are now being built into platforms like Zoom or Microsoft Teams, for example, if you turn it into what could that mean for our business? If you look at business travel and conferencing, what will be some of the features which we see there? If you look at virtual reality or augmented reality, how can it actually be used in our favor? And I think here what we'd like you to trigger to think about, go beyond the limitations of what we call so-called real life, and really allowing for those elements to blur. And just to show you an example of what we're going to expose here is much more what we call the element of identity. So when I used to be able to go to an office, I had my identity and my status, and there will be a whole new virtual identity. And how can we actually use that, which is much more in the area of personalization, but also how do I actually come across in a virtual world versus what we see the experience, which is virtual vacationing, augmented trips, so amplified trips versus the normal reality. And I think that's an interesting notion when you think about museums, for example, worldwide. How are they being, there's an additional layer which you can actually experience cities, not the way they are now in today's reality, but maybe you can experience them in how they used to be. An interesting example from Lithodome is VR that's actually doing the type of rebuilding cities. So an interesting notion I just want to leave you with at the end. So I think I'd love to hear your responses, but I think we're moving on to the next speaker. So what I just want to leave you with in terms of thought is a couple of things which I want to, which we want to give to the participants of today's forum. Is on one hand, we'll make available to you 3 reports. One is around the future and scenario planning, which you might want to use for your business. The other one is details around the seamless safety. What are the innovation opportunities, conscious travel, and also the one report on mixed reality. So we'll make sure they're available to you, or you can already have a look at smarttravellab.com. But the last thing, which we do exclusively for the forum participants, if you're interested in participating in one of the masterclasses around conscious travel, so thinking about what does conscious travel mean for you and how can you use that, we're organizing now a free half-day masterclass for the participants of the forum. So if you're interested to join that for your own business and explore those opportunities, drop me a note at the email address that you see here, and then I'll hand over kindly to Hilary, I think, to announce the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Christiaan. I think whenever I've seen your reports come through, I feel like you're really doing really interesting work and really putting thought and strategic thought into the frameworks that you create. So I'm really glad that you had the time to present to us as well. And we make sure that we send the reports around, as you said, and the presentation, so people can actually take this and use this, because I think it's hugely important. And I loved your idea of the mixed reality. I think that's definitely something that we're moving towards. So thank you for so many great ideas, Christiaan, and thanks for being on time. That means that everyone can now exit this room and go and join the next session that will start in about 4 minutes time. It will be about access, land, air, and sea. So because we all know that if we don't have connections and connectivity, tourism cannot restart. So thanks so much, Christiaan, again for joining us, and wish you all the best, and we'll make sure we put all the details for the workshops and reports to our audience as well. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Enjoy, everybody.
All right, we're off the live stream now, and I'm going to stop the recording as well.